For most of the world, the O.J. Simpson story feels finished. A trial watched by millions, a verdict argued endlessly, and a nation that eventually moved on. But history doesn't end just because a courtroom closes. For Sydney Brook Simpson, history never stopped replaying. While the public debated evidence and celebrity, she grew up inside the quiet aftermath, where truth wasn't denied loudly, but buried carefully. This documentary is not about reopening a legal case. It's about examining what happens to a child when survival depends on silence, and what it costs to carry a story the world refuses to hear. Sydney didn't grow up with answers. She grew up with rules. Don't talk. Don't remember. Don't ask. And above all, don't contradict a version of events that powerful people already agreed to protect. June 12, 1994 is often described as a single night of violence. But for Sydney, it became a permanent condition. She was 8 years old, inside her mother Nicole Brown Simpson's home in Brentwood, when the ordinary rhythms of childhood were interrupted by something terrifying and unfamiliar. Years later, psychological records would suggest that she wasn't asleep through the chaos, as the public assumed. She woke to sounds that didn't belong, movement that felt wrong, tension that filled the air before any scream was heard. Trauma specialists explain that children don't process danger like adults do. They don't analyze, they absorb. And when fear arrives without explanation, it rewires the nervous system. That night didn't end for Sydney when the sun came up. It embedded itself in her body, shaping how she listened, how she slept, how she learned to stay alive by staying quiet. Official police reports stated that Sydney and her younger brother were found unharmed upstairs. That sentence became a shield, a convenient summary that allowed the public to believe the children were untouched. But behind sealed documents and family court files, another reality existed. A social worker's emergency intervention note described a child in acute distress, withdrawn, hyperaware, frightened of open spaces and sudden noise. These aren't abstract symptoms. They are classic trauma responses. Experts agree, children who witness violence often freeze, not flee. Silence isn't absence. It's evidence of shock. What the public interpreted as ignorance may have actually been self-protection. And once that narrative was established, no one had an incentive to question it. Years later, Sydney would privately describe something she had never been allowed to say aloud. She remembered waking and seeing a large male figure near the back doorway. She remembered blood. She remembered knowing exactly who he was without needing to be told. Trauma memory doesn't work like a recording. It comes in fragments, sensations, images that refuse to fade. Critics often dismiss such recollections as unreliable. But psychologists note that emotional recognition is often stronger than visual clarity. Sydney didn't claim to remember everything. She remembered enough. And sometimes, that's what haunts a person the most. The idea that this violence came out of nowhere collapses under scrutiny. Long before 1994, police were repeatedly called to Nicole Brown Simpson's home. Domestic disturbance reports piled up. Officers documented visible injuries, emotional distress, and fear that never fully resolved. One call in 1989 stands out. Nicole hiding outside, bruised, terrified, barely dressed. An arrest followed. A plea was entered. And then, like so many domestic violence cases, the system treated it as finished business. But abuse doesn't end with paperwork. It adapts. It hides. It waits. For children growing up in violent households, danger becomes background noise. Sydney didn't need adult language to understand fear. She lived inside it. Custody filings later revealed concerns about emotional instability and control. These weren't rumors. They were legal warnings. Yet once the public narrative shifted toward celebrity and spectacle, those early signs were pushed aside. When violence becomes inconvenient, society often looks away. And children learn quickly which truths are welcome and which are not. As Sydney grew older, silence became both armor and prison. She learned that asking questions caused tension, that curiosity was risky, that remembering could destabilize the fragile peace surrounding her life. Trauma specialists call this adaptive suppression, a survival strategy common among children raised in unsafe environments. It works until it doesn't, because unspoken memory doesn't disappear. It waits. Publicly, her father maintained confidence and calm. Privately, according to later accounts, his words were carefully vague. Not denial, not confession. Something in between, phrases about anger, about things getting out of control, about moments you can't undo. To a child searching for clarity, ambiguity can be more damaging than truth. It keeps the wound open. The trial ended. The cameras moved on, but Sydney didn't get closure, she got conditioning. Silence was framed as protection, loyalty was expected, and fear was never named. Over time, that unspoken agreement became unbearable, because children grow up, and grown children start asking different questions. This is where part 1 ends, not with answers, but with pressure. A young girl carrying memories she was never supposed to have, living inside a story written by others. The night may have ended for America, but for Sydney Brook Simpson, it was only beginning. Adulthood did not free Sydney Brook Simpson from the past. It gave her the tools to finally understand it. Distance, education, and time allowed her to see patterns that once felt like personal confusion. What she had experienced as fear now had names: hypervigilance, trauma memory, conditioned silence. This mattered because for years, the public narrative suggested that the children were untouched, spared, too young to remember. But trauma does not ask permission before imprinting itself. Sydney wasn't searching for revenge or justice. She was searching for coherence, for a way to place her memories into a framework that didn't require self-doubt. And slowly, quietly, she began to realize that what she remembered wasn't an anomaly. It aligned with documented history. Her academic path reflected this internal reckoning. Choosing sociology was not accidental. She studied crime, media influence, and the long-term psychological effects on children tied to public violence. Professors later noted her analytical precision and emotional restraint. She never personalized her work. She never used names, but the themes were unmistakable. How institutions protect power, how narratives become weapons, how silence is often enforced, not chosen. Education gave Sydney something she had never been offered before: validation without exposure. She could examine violence without becoming its headline. Privately, her relationship with her father grew increasingly strained. Conversations avoided specifics, drifting instead into abstractions about anger, mistakes, and consequences that couldn't be undone. This kind of language is familiar to trauma specialists. It's a way to acknowledge harm without claiming responsibility. To a child, even an adult child, this ambiguity is destabilizing. It denies closure while demanding loyalty. Sydney wasn't asking him to confess. She was asking him to be honest, and that honesty never came. The moment that shifted everything arrived quietly. A book placed in her hands, If I Did It. Not framed as fiction, not defended as theory, but offered as insight. "You'll understand me better." That sentence mattered, because it shifted the burden. Instead of explaining himself, he asked her to interpret him. Experts describe this as emotional displacement, asking someone else to carry the weight of what you won't name. Sydney read the book not as literature, but as subtext. The details, the tone. The proximity to reality disguised as hypothetical. What she felt wasn't shock, it was confirmation. After that, contact ended. No dramatic announcement, no media leak, just absence. Cutting ties with a parent is rarely impulsive, it's cumulative. It happens after years of negotiation, disappointment, and self-betrayal. Sydney later described it as choosing mental survival over biological obligation. Silence, once enforced, became chosen. That shift changed everything. Her communication with the Goldman family's legal representatives was brief but telling. She didn't seek forgiveness. She didn't offer apologies. She expressed a desire for acknowledgement. That distinction matters. Forgiveness centers the offender. Acknowledgement centers reality. Sydney understood that justice, as defined by courts, had already failed. What she wanted was recognition of harm, quiet, human, and unpublicized. Years later, as illness approached, she made one final visit. Not to reconcile, not to heal him, but to reclaim herself. Witness accounts describe a short, restrained meeting. No raised voices, no absolution. She spoke so the truth would exist outside her body. Trauma specialists emphasize this moment, when survivors speak not to change the past, but to stop carrying it alone. When she left, she didn't leave as a daughter seeking approval. She left as a witness who had finally testified to herself. After his death, the public response followed familiar lines. Debate, division, nostalgia versus outrage, but Sydney's actions cut through the noise. She refused the inheritance, entirely, legally, permanently. This was not symbolic, it was procedural, deliberate, and irreversible. In a culture where money often launders legacy, her refusal was radical. She didn't want wealth tied to violence. She didn't want comfort built on denial. She wanted moral separation. Legal records confirmed that this decision was not impulsive. Months before his death, she had already begun disentangling herself from trusts and financial structures designed to benefit her. This foresight matters. It shows intent. She wasn't reacting emotionally, she was acting ethically. To her, accepting that money would mean participating in a system that had protected the wrong person for decades. What followed was not disappearance, but reconstruction. Sydney built a life designed around control and privacy. She entered real estate. She created businesses with strict boundaries between her identity and her family name. Growth was steady. Risk was managed. Independence was total. She declined every media request. 16 formal offers. 16 refusals. Her reason never changed. Public storytelling risked reopening psychological harm that had taken decades to stabilize. Therapy records from her adolescence into adulthood reveal long-term treatment for post-traumatic stress. Not to erase memory, but to manage it. Healing did not mean forgetting. It meant functioning, sleeping, listening to a door close without panic. Trauma recovery is not linear, and Sydney never claimed to be cured. She claimed to be stable. That distinction is honest. When she finally spoke after her father's death, it wasn't through press conferences or documentaries. It was through private statements that later surfaced. She didn't dramatize, she didn't exaggerate. She stated what she remembered, what she heard, what she recognized. She didn't claim total recall. She claimed enough. Enough to know fear wasn't imagined. Enough to know her mother's terror had context. What makes her account difficult to dismiss isn't emotion, it's alignment. Her memories align with police records, with medical diagnoses, with domestic violence reports, with her lifelong refusal to publicly defend her father, with her severing of contact, with her rejection of his estate. Patterns tell stories long before people do. This doesn't overturn a verdict. It reframes a narrative. It reminds us that legal outcomes and lived truth are not the same thing. Courts decide guilt. Memory decides meaning. And for those who grow up inside violence, truth often exists long before language does. Sydney Brook Simpson didn't ask to be believed. She spoke, then returned to privacy. That restraint is what gives her words weight. Some truths don't need a courtroom. They need courage. And sometimes the bravest act isn't speaking loudly, but finally speaking at all.